Energy media readers, if you spend any time on social media, you will have run across the argument, and probably often run across the argument, that Eastern Canadian oil imports of about 650,000 barrels a day should be banned, they should be barred, there should be import quotas, we should not be bringing in oil from Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a problematic argument, but there actually is some data and economic analysis that supports that. So to talk about that today, we're going to be chatting with Allan Fogwill, who's the CEO of the Canadian Energy Research Institute. So welcome to the interview, Allan.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you did a study a couple of years ago, about maybe it was 18 months ago, and I interviewed you about it then. It was about Eastern Canadian imports. And one of the conclusions that you and your team came to is there actually is a higher economic impact if Canadian oil were to displace imports in Eastern Canada.
Yes, there's a positive economic impact, because if you look at the overall cost of production going into the refineries in Eastern Canada, we could see a significant cost savings in hundreds of millions of dollars a year for the Eastern Canadian refinery. So there's definitely a positive economic impact associated with using and refining more Canadian oil in Canada than relying on imported oil.
One of the surprising conclusions that your study came to was the fact that approximately 50% of the imported oil could already be displaced by Canadian oil.
Yes, it's still an issue we don't fully understand. We've got some assumptions about why it's not already occurring. One of them is associated with the particular characteristics of the oil, and refineries are very sensitive to ensuring they get the right oil characteristics. Not all oil is treated or is the same. And so any change would mean a change to how they actually operate their systems. And every time there's a change to how they operate their system, there's a cost implication. So you're not going to move from one source of oil to another without some good reasons. The other element to consider is that they have contracts. And so it's not that easy to change suppliers at the drop of a hat.
Exactly. But your study also found that there would be fewer greenhouse gas emissions if Canadian oil displaced foreign oil.
Yes, and that's actually takes into account the additional greenhouse gas emissions that would be coming from Canada because of the additional activity and, of course, the transport of that oil from Western Canada or from the East Coast to those refineries. So this is the big issue that we have right now internationally with the management of our greenhouse gas emissions. They're all done domestically. And yet there are some cases where you can replace one source with another in terms of oil, gas, or electricity, but yet it may create some additional emissions in your own territory, but bring down global emissions. And you can't get credit for that right now. And so no one does that.
Right, fair enough. Let's talk about where that will come from, because very often when the argument is made, it's made in a Western Canadian context. If we could just get more Alberta oil into Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, but in fact, Eastern Canada produces a fair amount of oil, and that is fairly competitive in the Ontario, or at least in the Quebec markets, correct?
That's correct. I mean, offshore Newfoundland has producing a significant amount of oil, 300,000 barrels a day, roughly. And all that oil goes on to tankers anyways. And once it goes onto a tanker, it can go anywhere. So the tankers can likely get to at least the refineries in Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Quebec. It's unlikely, or we're not quite sure if they can get to the refineries in Ontario because of the St. Lawrence Seaway.
What about pipeline capacity? Because it seems, if I remember our previous interview correctly, there is some opportunity to use existing infrastructure without building a new pipeline.
Yes, in our analysis, we found that with the existing infrastructure, we can get about 50% of the light oil from Western Canada or offshore Newfoundland. In this case, we're really focused on Western Canada into that eastern market. So that wouldn't require any additional infrastructure, but it would require using the existing pipelines that are operating both in Canada and the United States, because one of those pipelines that would be used would be coming out of or is operated in the United States.
How hard would it be for Canadian oil to displace the American imports? And I checked the Canadian Energy Regulator data today, and American oil makes up about 78% of Canadian imports, so it's very significant. Saudi Arabia is down around 12%, I think, right. And then a number of other smaller import companies or countries, sorry, like UK and Norway and so on. So why would it be difficult to displace the Americans?
Well, it's not difficult physically. It may be difficult economically. A lot of the American oil comes in is from the Bakken in North Dakota in that region, and it is very high quality oil. It's very light. It's almost gasoline quality, and so it is a very valuable product. So it's not clear at this point to me whether or not a lot of the American oil could be displaced economically, and that would mean some sort of agreement between governments, refineries, and producers to offset some of those economic impacts.
Now, when I was looking at the data, Allan, I was very interested to find that the Bakken provided about 1/3 of the Eastern Canadian oil. Of course, the Bakken is that basin is partly in Saskatchewan and partly in North Dakota,
and Manitoba,
right? And the other 2/3 of U.S. Imports come from Texas. Now, that's a long way away from Ontario, probably as far or further than Alberta. So why is that more economic, or is it more economic to bring it from Texas?
It depends. The one advantage that Texas has, or the United States has, is they've got a very significant oil pipeline infrastructure that can move that oil across the country. The disadvantage in the Bakken in North Dakota is that they don't have a pipeline and therefore have to move it via rail, which is expensive. So where their production costs may be lower, their transportation costs are higher. In Texas, you've got the availability of pipelines to move some of that oil from there up to Canada. So distance is not as relevant when you have a significant pipeline infrastructure in place.
Interesting. The final question, Allan, is around ESG, which is environment, social, and governance. And ESG scores have become increasingly important to investors and to the financial community over the last couple of years, and particularly we saw BlackRock CEO Larry Fink mention them in his letter in mid-January about allocation of capital, now depending on climate policies and so on. So where does light Canadian oil fit on the ESG scoreboard?
Well, here's where I have to rely on a lot of disparate pieces of information, because right now we have a significant lack of data that can fundamentally prove one jurisdiction is better than another on some of these characteristics, in particular, the environmental performance characteristics. But based on the information I've been able to, look at over the last number of years, Canadian light oil is as good or better from an ESG standard than almost any other jurisdiction in the world. And if you look at what's going on in terms of the oil sands, because this is a different issue, of course, where they have some concerns related to heavy energy use, and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look at all the other characteristics, they are quite highly marked as well. Now, the real challenge is how do you make a proper comparison between Canadian oil, either light or oil sands, heavy, with other jurisdictions, because not all jurisdictions collect this information. We're talking about not just greenhouse gas emissions, but land use and water use and access to wilderness areas. We're talking about social contracts with local procurement value chains, with indigenous organizations, a whole host of characteristics. So where we've been in a situation where people have focused on greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of ESGs overall, based on my understanding, I would say Canada is at the top or near the top.
Now, I think it's really important to make the point that there has never been a drop of oil bought or sold on the basis of its ethical composition. It's all about price and grade and so on. But it may be in the future, I think the trend would be at some point that ESG scores, carbon taxes, some of those other mechanisms that would give Canadian light oil an advantage perhaps in the marketplace. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, it is. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion internationally and even in Canada about what we're calling sustainable finance. And sustainable finance is really around this concept about using these ESG standards to help guide your investments. Not a lot of that is happening right now. There's a lot of discussion about it, but again, there's a lack of data. Now, that's just in terms of investments, and also you see it in terms of the insurance industry as well. But you're not seeing any of that reflected in basic supply and demand transactions. Companies and customers are buying based on price, and price. That's it. These ESG standards are not factored into any price elements for oil or gas or any fossil fuels that I'm aware of.
Allan, thank you very much for this. Appreciate your concise and cogent analysis as always, and we'll look forward to having you on again.
Sure, no problems.